modeling landscape dynamics, landscape patterns analysis, among many others. Furthermore, he has participated in the development of statistical and computational tools that are useful to study vegetation distribution, growth, and regeneration along different gradients, and the effect of landscape management, such as fire and climate change over vegetational patterns and processes at the landscape scale. As an example of his job is the BRACSAT program. He is a researcher at the Rocky Mountain Research Station from the U.S. Forestry Services.
Le damos la bienvenida al Dr. Cushman con la charla Landscape Connectivity, Corridor Modeling and Applications in Conservation.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming back after lunch. I know it is siesta time, and I appreciate the attendance. I also am tired. I did not sleep well last night, but with luck, we will get through this, and the rest of the evening will be quite more enjoyable. But talk today is about connectivity and application conservation. And so, we all know the dire straits the biosphere is in. Earth is truly facing mass extinction with large portions of fauna and flora across the world threatened with extinction, and is driven primarily by habitat loss and exploitation by people, and obviously with populations that have tripled in the last 50 years in the world and still rising with per capita consumption continuing to rise even faster. The human footprint continues to grow very rapidly, and that has large impacts in ecosystems and population. So connectivity modeling, as we talked earlier, is one of the keys to viable populations, because populations change through a combination of births, deaths, immigration, and emigration, and connectivity drives migration, which can lead to demographic rescue. It can lead to colonization of extinct metapopulations, and can stave off inbreeding depression, among other things. So understanding the connectivity of populations across landscapes is essential. So the parts of this talk I will cover are how you use landscape genetics, how you use movement modeling, those two things sometimes in combination, to infer landscape resistance, and then how you predict connectivity and corridors on this resistance map. So one of the things we've been doing a lot of the last 10 years or more is trying to understand gene flow as it is affected by landscapes, composition, and configuration. And the first work we did on this was on black bears in Idaho, in the northern Rockies, the United States. And what we were trying to do was infer genetic processes, population processes, patterns of genetic differentiation among individuals across broad landscapes. And so we sampled a bunch of bears, about 146 individual bears, and each of those bears we got a bunch of genetic information from, and you can calculate the genetic distance, which is essentially the relatedness among these bears, how closely they are related. Bears that are closely related have recent common ancestors, and that is an indication of gene flow between the locations that they exist at. So understanding the patterns of genetic relatedness across space can tell us a great deal about what drives population connectivity. And so there are many different hypotheses you can propose for what drives gene flow. Isolation by distance is an obvious and classic expectation. And you can calculate a matrix that is dimensions of the number of individuals by number of individuals, which has the geographical distance between each individual in there. And then that is a matrix whose hypothesis is farther apart you are in space, the less similar you will be genetically. In other words, as you increase in distance, gene flow decreases, connectivity decreases, but it decreases isotropically uniformly with distance. It's a classical expectation for population genetics. An alternative classical explanation is isolation by barriers. In this study area, there is a big valley down the middle between two mountain ranges. And you can have a hypothesis that this valley, which is agricultural fields and is not occupied by bears, you can have a hypothesis that this valley is a barrier. And so you can make a matrix that has that model implemented with zeros indicating individuals that are on the same side of that potential barrier, and zero meaning no cost between them. Propose that there's a pan-mixed population in each of those mountain ranges. And you put a 1 between individuals that are separated across that barrier. In this statistical model, a 1 indicates a barrier because it's infinitely larger than 0 in terms of proportionality. So, you have two null models, which are very common in null models in landscape genetics: isolation by distance and isolation by barriers. And that was what people had done in conservation genetics until about 10 years ago. What was new in landscape genetics was trying to understand the influence of landscape heterogeneity on genetic differentiation, on gene flow, on population connectivity. And so there are a number of things that vary in this landscape, like the elevation, the topography, the topographical slope, how steep the landscape is in the mountains, the distribution of forest cover, distribution of roads. And all of these things you could hypothesize can influence gene flow of bears. Maybe bears prefer to move to high elevations, maybe they prefer to move to low elevations or middle elevations. So you can have 3 different levels: high, medium, and low, with the elevation factor. Likewise, steep slopes might be resistant to bears, but perhaps bears think you don't like steep slopes, so it could be a very high effect, perhaps a low effect, perhaps there's no effect. So you can have several different levels for how slope might affect. Same with forest cover and roads. And so each of these you can represent as a GIS model of hypothetical resistance to movement. So here is a surface. It's a landscape model. It is showing, in this case, blue areas at high elevation up to the tops of mountains. Red areas at low elevation in the valley. Blue in this model means low resistance, low cost for movement. So basically this model says bears can move to high elevations easily, but they have a movement cost when going down to low elevations. So for each of these hypotheses, there's 108 combinations of the slope, forest, roads, land cover models that I described. For each of those combinations, you can make a matrix of the costs of moving through this landscape between all the locations these bears are, if that hypothesis is true. So then you have a genetic distance matrix, you have a barrier matrix, you have a Euclidean distance matrix, and you have cost distance matrices for each of these alternative landscape resistance models. Then you can test the relationship between the landscape resistance and the genetic differentiation, comparing the genetic distance with the barrier model, the distance model, and these 108 landscape resistance models. And we do that through something called partial Mantel tests. There's a correlation between distance matrices. And when we do that, we found there were about 10 or 12 models that were statistically supported in a correlation between the genetic structure of the bear population and the cost distance of that hypothesis, independent of null models of distance of bears. So these are landscape resistance hypotheses that are better than the classical models, isolation by distance and isolation by resistance. There's a clear pattern in these models. They're concentrated to be in the middle elevation, high forest cover. So we infer from this that bears movement and gene flows facilitated by forest cover and middle elevations. They don't like to cross non-forest areas, they don't like to go to the highest elevations or the lowest elevations. And there are some other methods that we employ to test the rigor of that conclusion, competing it with these two normal models of isolation by distance and isolation by barriers, something called causal modeling of distance matrices. Provides a means to test which of the landscape barrier or distance models is supported. And there's a diagnostic set of expectations with partial correlations, Mantel test. And if a landscape model is supported and the distance and barriers are spurious, you should expect to see a significant landscape correlation independently of the barrier model, a significant landscape correlation independent of the distance model, and no relationship between the barrier model and the distance model, independent of the landscape model. And this is what we found. So this allowed us to compete 110 models, find the best one, and demonstrate that this best landscape model was statistically independent and better, and reject the barrier and distance hypothesis. So we produced what is called a resistance model, which is a GIS map, which shows for every pixel in the landscape, its inferred cost of movement for bears, optimized based on the observed pattern of gene flow. Period. So, here's a question. Do you think we are right? How many ways are there to be right in science? Yeah, one way. Some people say more than one way, but I think one way. How many ways are you wrong? Infinite number, right? So given you have an infinite opportunity to be wrong and one chance to be right, we always want to verify, validate our results with independent data sets in what we call meta-replicated studies in different places, or using different kind of data, different kind of analysis, independent data, to see if we get the right answer. Because it turns out it's actually very, very easy to be wrong. It's very hard to be wrong the same way with different methods. So if you get the same answer with different methods, it's very unlikely that that's just random occurrence. So the second approach to infer resistance to movement that we developed was path level analysis of movement. So we put GPS collars on 25 or about that number of black bears. We followed them around the mountains, and they made these paths. And those paths show you where that bear was every 10 minutes for the entire year of its life that we were monitoring. And from that, you can determine what kinds of features that bear was selecting. Where did it go? Was it in forest more than you'd expect? Was it in roads more than you'd expect? So to do that, you do what we call path level randomization. You take the used path, which is the dark old red line, and you shift it, you rotate it randomly within the dispersal ability of the bear. And those are available paths with identical spatial characteristics, autocorrelation characteristics, which is important. You'll block that out. But then you compare with something called conditional logistic regression. The characteristics of the used path, the characteristics of the available path. And it happened in this case that the movement model suggests that bears prefer middle elevation forest cover and avoided low elevations and high elevations. And it's very similar overall to the model from our genetic analysis, which gave us more confidence that likely we were on the correct answer, at least approximately. So then, from that, we do connectivity modeling. So we develop a resistance surface, which is the cost of moving across the landscape. There's the grayscale figure on the left hand of this map. Dark colors, black, is low cost of movement, middle elevation forest. Bright colors, white, is high cost of movement, not forest, which is low elevation, which which is water and roads. And so our first analysis using that result was to evaluate how bears would optimally move from Yellowstone National Park to Canada. And that's because there are important bear populations in Yellowstone that people think might be vulnerable because of small population size and isolation. And there are relatively larger numbers of bears in the northern Rocky Mountains than in Canada. And so understanding the connectivity between Yellowstone National Park and Canada is important for applied conservation. So what we did is something called factorial least cost path modeling. So we put source bears, make-believe simulated bears, along the border of Yellowstone National Park, 200. And put 200 simulated bears along the border of Canada. And across this resistance surface, we have each bear take the least cost path across this resistance surface to every other bear in the north and south respectively. And that produces corridors that are predicted to be the optimal ways you can go from Yellowstone to Canada across this resistance surface. And you can see the intensity. Red lines, there are two on this map, indicate many paths going through that spot. The blue line indicates fewer paths. But the main story is there are very few good ways to go from Yellowstone to Canada. They only go up two little mountain ranges north of Yellowstone. The main path goes basically straight north, and the smaller path goes off to the west. And so the picture to the right, we intersected that with highways and non-protected land, found 25 places where connectivity would be at risk along these optimal movement routes that then people can use for mitigation. They can avoid development in those critical locations. They can build highway overpasses or underpasses to promote bear movement. So it's a way to focus and concentrate conservation effort in places that would be probably most beneficial. But this analysis was limited because it was only from Canada to Yellowstone. And many other people are interested in connectivity from other places in the study area. So we wrote a second paper, which did the same thing on the same resistance map, but instead of from one place to another place, Canada to Yellowstone, we went from everywhere bears could live to everywhere else bears could live. Hundreds of millions of least cost paths, and 9 months of computing them to make this little thing. But it's very informative because it gives you the relative density of movement routes across this entire area, which is 30 million hectares. Dark orange are predicted to be places with very frequent bear passage through them. Blue areas less frequent, and areas that have no color, that is gray, are predicted not to be used by bears in their movement. And that then we can use to evaluate the suitability of a wide range of management alternatives, identify the most important potential barriers across the entire population, and evaluate the suitability of mitigation efforts that had already been done. There is a highway in the middle of Montana, sort of in the middle of that picture, that has had one of the biggest wildlife crossing mitigation projects in the world done there. And they had something like 42 crossing structures built. And so we were able to use this to rank the importance of the corridors across the entire landscape, intersect that with where the crossing locations were. And they didn't have this kind of data when they built it. They just had expert knowledge, but they are not ignorant. They can tell where the forest is, where the bottlenecks are between mountain ranges. And it happens that they put their major structure, the big wildlife bridge, within a few hundred meters of the second most intense corridor in the entire area based on the north. So I think they did relatively well. But it gives us an ability to evaluate a range of alternative management and conservation scenarios with something that's not just an expert opinion. It's a resistance surface that's been optimized by genetics, by movement, I did not mention, but also by replication of the genetic study in 12 different study areas So fairly highly embedded resistance surface repair. And then an application of a connectivity model gives us what we call a spatially synoptic view, connectivity across the entire system. So that was what we got with this bear work. And then we developed some additional applications of those methods, collaboration with people at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford. And they had been studying population connectivity, gene flow corridors for lion movement in southern Africa. In a place called the Kabano Zambezi Trans-Frontier Conservation Area, which includes parts of Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Namibia. And as one of the few remaining lion strongholds, lions in the last 150 years had a 90% reduction in range and probably more than that, a reduction in population, probably 95% reduction in population. And so you can see where they exist now and where they previously existed. This area of focus is that right there. That's the Kabongo Zambezi Trans-Frontier Conservation Area. And what we wanted to do was to use these kinds of methods I developed for the bears, apply them to lions. And so they were, over the last 15 years, able to gather probably the biggest carnivore telemetry data set in the world, about 50 individual lions and GPS collars in this region here in Zimbabwe. And so we did the same thing that we did with bear. This path level analysis, shifting and rotating paths randomly to compare a used path to a distribution of available paths with this conditional logistic regression, which allows you to find the relative degree of selection and avoidance of different landscape features in lion movement. And what was very interesting about this study and unique is they had enough lions that we could build models for adult territorial female lions, adult territorial male lions, and juvenile dispersal lions, which is very, very important because in lions and in most mammals, dispersal is affected through juvenile movements, primarily males. So it's important to understand if there's a difference in landscape resistance and connectivity for male lions or female lions or dispersal lions. And so we were able to build these models for each of those groups. And we found this. Here are landscape resistance based on that path randomization for juvenile dispersers. Blue colors are low cost of movement, red colors are high cost. These are adult males. You see more red, less blue. These are adult females. See more red, less blue. And what we found is there's a huge difference in movement between these demographic groups. Females were exceptionally risk averse. They stayed inside the parks and protected areas. National parks are blue. Wildlife areas that are primarily managed for wildlife are yellow. And what we call communal lands in Africa are red, very high cost. They don't go there, like almost never. Then, the adult males slightly less risk averse, and the juvenile dispersers much, much less. Very little difference at all between these wildlife areas and these communal lands. Sometimes with very high population densities of humans are high resistance, but overall relatively flat resistance surface. And that is very interesting. And when you compare the adult males to the juveniles, you calculate the difference in resistance. Blue areas are more resistant for juvenile movement than for adult males. Very interesting. Juveniles have more resistance to move through national parks than adult males. And the yellow and red are places where juveniles have less resistance than males. And it's a very interesting story. It's related to intraspecific conflict. These parks all have territorial adult male lions in them. And when a juvenile lion meets the adult territorial male lion, he has a very bad experience and often is killed. And so we found that when they're moving to juveniles, like suboptimal habitat, more scrubby, brushy terrain with less wildlife in it, and they prefer to move outside of the parks to avoid the adult males. Now that's interesting because they have what we call an experience of fear. They fear the adult male lions, and so they leave the parks much more readily to avoid it. But they therefore are behaving in ways that are inconsistent with the true risk. Meeting an adult male lion is dangerous, but going out here to these communal lands and meeting some cows is worse, because you will be killed. All of them are killed when they go there. So these juvenile lions are behaving in ways that might evolutionarily have made sense, avoiding territorial male lions, but they are doing it in a landscape that has asymmetrical risks compared to their evolutionary behavioral pattern. And they make decisions, therefore, that put them into great danger of death. And so we were able to compare the implications of this for movement with this least cost path method for juvenile dispersers, for females, and for males. And on the juvenile dispersers, while they are making these more risky decisions, have the potential to connect between populations that these more risk-averse adults do not. So they have two things. They have experienced much actual greater risk in their movement, but in doing so, they have the potential to provide demographic rescue, gene flow between populations that you'd expect to be isolated if you're modeling based on adult animals. So a paper that is just recently accepted in landscape ecology, we took that final resistance model and we wanted to evaluate the connectivity of this lion population across a bunch of different scenarios of landscape change. And so in this talk so far, I've showed you some examples of least cost path modeling, where you have a resistant surface like this, where blue, dark areas are low cost, red is high cost. You can calculate the least cost path among them. I showed you this, what I call factorial least cost path analysis, where you calculate millions and millions of those between thousands of combinations of points. You get a network sort of like this, like a vascular system of the population that predicts very high rates of movement. But we recognize there are limitations to this. This is very nice if you're interested in the single best location to put a structure on the highway. That's where it is. But people who understand animal movement know that these animals are not going to walk that little tightrope of the perfect path. They're going to flow across the landscape differentially as a function of the cost of movement. And so we developed a method we call cumulative resistant kernel modeling, which is kind of like a familiar method to many, which is the least cost corridor, which we calculate cost distance between 2 points and intersect them, and you get a corridor of low cost between them. And so that's the solution if you're trying to find the lowest cost way to get from this point to that point. But in our spatially synoptic model, I'm not particularly interested in that point or that point. I'm interested in connectivity across the entire system. And the resistant kernel approach allows you to do that. It allows you to put dispersers across the landscape proportional to their distribution density, and you disperse them as a function of the cost surface, and it produces a cumulative surface, which is red areas are high probability of a bear, in this case, moving through that cell. Blue are low probability. This can be scaled directly into probability of occurrence in that cell or movement through that cell for every place in the landscape. And there's great advantages to that. It gives you the ability to answer a wide range of questions at multiple scale. And so it works like this. You see blue dots up here. These are source locations that you are modeling from, and each one you put a dispersive kernel in a uniformly suitable landscape. Those are Gaussian shapes that attenuate symmetrically with distance. In a resistant world, there's differential cost of movement, and so those shapes attenuate when they hit roads or developed areas or other features that are high resistance. And so this, for example, lets you see the difference in connectivity caused by these particular features in this landscape at the dispersal ability singular. And so it works in this case there. You put a single dispersal there, you calculate a least cost kernel away from it, up to a dispersal ability of that bear. You determine that from the range of genetic correlation, which is highly related to parent-offspring dispersal distance. And then you do that for every location a bear exists in the landscape. And you get this cumulus resistant kernel surface, which is spatially synoptic. It gives you expected frequency or density of movement through every cell. And it's multiple scale. You can look at different ranges of dispersal ability and how there are thresholds of connectivity as a function of dispersal ability. And importantly, it gives you predictions directly in the form of probability of dispersers traversing each location. So look at this. In this case in Southern Africa, we have 9 scenarios. The current situation: green are national parks. These 2 other colors are forest reserves and wildlife reserves. We removed wildlife management areas without IUCN status, which is not an unrealistic scenario. We removed all areas not national parks, which is a somewhat extreme scenario, but not implausible given the growth of population resources down there. And we also implemented a couple of scenarios of active management to improve connectivity, placing corridors of low resistance between the gaps in our protected area network, and then use fences as an alternative to these corridors to try to keep dispersal lines focused to the gaps between protected areas and away from areas of high risk of conflict. And fencing national parks, so that's a topic that people have discussed as a solution to wildlife conflict. In the existing network of veterinary fences, how that might affect connectivity. Doubling the human population, which is happening in the next 30 years, and fencing the national parks and everything else converted under land use. And for each of these, we ran this resistant kernel across it with this resistant surface based on an optimized movement model from all these dispersing lines, and we get a map of expected frequency of line dispersal through any pixel in the landscape. You can see core areas, you can see linkages among them, you can see gaps where there may be limited dispersal. And then you can go through and compare this to these different scenarios. You remove these wildlife management areas, reduce connectivity by almost 20%. When you have only national parks, there's like a 54% reduction in connectivity. It's a very large effect. Adding corridors had a huge increase in the size of the single largest patch. Basically makes the whole thing percolate. Because it makes the gaps go away. And so there are now bridges between these isolated islands, and we can quantify the effect from this extent of the area connected by dispersal. And then if you have only national parks and fence them, there's a giant reduction, 70% in the total extent of the landscape connected by dispersal. So that's just a very brief overview of the analysis. We had 9 scenarios. I didn't show you them all. We had several different dispersal abilities to bracket the uncertainty in that. But you get the idea of what the application is. And you probably also get immediately come to mind an issue that we touched on earlier. We said that these juvenile animals, juvenile lions, are making decisions based on fear of intraspecific conflict, that elevates their risk. The modeling I just showed you, which is the current modeling, doesn't assess risk. It doesn't have differential mortality. It only shows you the probability of moving and assumes that those dispersers will survive, which isn't realistic. So what we're doing now is applying individual-based spatially explicit population movement model called CPOP, which you'll hear more about tomorrow. And it allows us to evaluate population dynamics and connectivity and couples simultaneously very risky as a function of human land use and resistance as a function of behavior, and interact them to see how they combine to drive population dynamics and connectivity. So we can evaluate changes in mortality across the landscape and the interactive effects of connectivity and mortality on genetic differentiation, population size, and frequency of movement. That's ongoing. But to summarize some things that we've learned, there are lots and lots of ways you can optimize connectivity models with empirical data, genetics, movement, occurrence, and there are huge improvements over expert opinion, which is often wrong. But it is often not feasible to get that kind of data in the place you need it when you need it, because in a lot of parts of the world, there is immediate and ongoing land conversion and population exploitation that conservation action has to happen immediately. And so it's sometimes useful to just apply principles that we've learned, like habitat extent is always important. You don't have the ability to model everything to the 10th decimal point of precision. When you can remember from Kim's amazingly insightful work, there are nonlinear extinction thresholds that have that area decline and remains dispersal ability and demographic potential. Knowing that is useful. So you can say, well, bigger areas are better than smaller areas. And if you know something about the ecology of the system, you might be able to deal a little better than just this is better than that. But as a rule of thumb, that's a general rule that is useful. And we also know habitat fragmentation can reduce. Breaking habitat into patches increases mortality because of extra effects. Reducing local fitness within patches, and it can also increase risk of mortality and moving between patches. So, staying in habitat in one patch is usually preferred. We have also learned that protecting corridors and connectivity can improve population. So we have a network of these isolated patches protecting or restoring movement corridors among them can improve viability, but it depends. And the corridors are well placed, well proposed, so that they're used by the species concerned. So we've also learned that it is not clear in many cases that whether you can enhance connectivity to mitigate habitat loss. That is, we can shrink these patches here and say, okay, well, that's not a problem because I'm going to make some corridor in between them. And improvement in dispersal among habitats generally does not compensate for the negative effects of habitat loss. So you can't use corridors in those cases to fully mitigate the effects of habitat loss. And buffer zones around certain protected areas can be important because they can be effective in protecting the ecological integrity of the areas, providing additional matrix dispersal, population supplementation. So to put it together, when you can do grid science, But if you don't have time, and if you're focused on conservation in a changing world, you often don't have time. So it is useful to then apply these principles in an order of priority. First, in most places, you would want to keep the population from being killed directly. And for example, for lions, it doesn't matter if they have all these parks, but if they're being killed by poachers beyond replacement, all the connectivity in the world is not going to matter. So prevent the population from being killed. And then protect large core populations and habitats to provide big core areas for sources for a large viable populations. And then, if you can do those 2 things, then you can talk about corridors. Most people these days just go straight to corridors. Corridors don't need anything if the animals are being killed. And they don't need anything if the core populations are being eroded to an extent that they're not going to be viable. So I think corridors are important. Link it to those articles, only if you dealt with core populations and direct mortality. That's important. People get sort of obsessed with connectivity and forget the fundamentals of populations, which are about birth and death. And immigration is important. Birth and death drives the vote. So the last thing, if you can establish multiple use buffers, protection against development surrounding core areas, that's good. That will help. But I wouldn't worry too much about buffers. You can't do the first 2 things. So it's sort of a triage of goals. And once you've done that, you should still invest in improving your ideas, improving your knowledge. Every time we have tested expert opinion, it has been wrong. So while these rules of thumb go into expert opinion, and maybe it's better than nothing in the triage of the crisis, if you want to optimize your management and actually understand the process of driving the population, it is important to then continue to work on movement modeling, gene flow modeling, putting those together to optimize statistical approaches to evaluate different scenarios of landscape change, evaluate the optimality of different conservation and management alternatives. So, to sum it up, to optimize conservation strategies, landscape ecology. We can use these ideas that the speakers today have all described, methods, to optimize the implementation of these basic principles and refine how well they fit a particular species or system in a particular place and time. So you can use that and evaluate what action, where will have the greatest benefit to a population. Because particularly in conservation, we can't do everything. Usually we fight to do one thing. If you like that one thing, be a good thing. So it's important to try to optimize what you're doing to have the best effect. And evaluate how to minimize adverse effect of other changes. So, in the biggest picture of a global conservation crisis, the rules of thumb and the statistical method you described, we can apply these things to varying degrees based on the data that are available, and the resources we have at hand. But in almost all cases, that isn't what is limited effective conservation action. Usually, it's a combination of social values. Do the people care? Economic priorities. Does it pay? Political influence. Who wants this versus that? And much of the world is corruption. I'm working a lot in Africa, I'm working in India, I'm working in Southeast Asia. In those places, I can spend years developing the most perfect, statistically verified, validated model of population dynamics and connectivity. It doesn't mean anything if we can't achieve social, economic, and political agreement. And so that all requires, fundamentally, for conservation everywhere in the world, it requires strong civil institutions governed by the rule of law. Fundamentally, we need laws that are strong and that are consistently enforced to enable management to have a scientific basis for conservation goals. So the more time I spend in this, I get farther and farther into more and more sophisticated methods. But the other half of my life is trying to apply these things in Africa, apply these things in Asia, apply these things elsewhere. And my experience is I'm most effective trying to apply these things when I present simple ideas that are easy to understand, that decision makers, lawmakers, and the public can intuitively grasp. Bigger areas are better than smaller areas. Unfragmented areas are better than fragmented. Corridors improve. You've got to keep the animals from being killed at first. Then you can illustrate it with some of these simulations and analyses that people like maps, but keeping it as simple as possible. Make sure it's clearly explored. And make sure it's feasible. Don't say, well, you got to protect every tree in the country. That's my recommendation. It is not going to happen. Make sure it's feasible to be implemented from the social, political, and economic reality. So that's the bottom line is the biodiversity crisis is escalating. And immediate action is needed in most places. We often hear scientists say, well, I don't know the answer. If we had more money and more time, we'd study it. And that's true for perfect scientific knowledge. But to make a difference in applications, we often have to ask now, act now. And there are ways to blend the best knowledge we have with the best methods that we have time and resources to employ, with rules of thumb that we have developed for how to apply effective, simple strategies that people can understand and that can be implemented. So that's the end, and I'll answer your questions.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it very much. And I wonder if you could make a suggestion as to how to effectively evaluate the efficiency of a corridor. Like, if we propose to make them, somebody would ask how many they are working.
Yeah. That's a very good question. And I can give you a couple of examples. So in southern India, I'm working on projects in the Western Ghats on elephants. And so we did not have time or money to develop a telemetry-based or genetic-based business model. We developed an expert-based model, knowing something about how elephants can move, how steep slopes affect them, various things like that. And we applied that model and then evaluated its fit with these resistant kernel methods with a bunch of corridors that were proposed by the Parks Department. But how do you know which one's better? Are we better than them? Are they better than us? So what we were able to do, since resistant kernels calibrate the frequency of movement through a pixel, it is very closely related to the density of elements. And in this part of India, they have very good density surveys. So across 1,000 square kilometers, they have density estimates. And then we can say, do their corridors match the density of the elephant more than ours? Now, density isn't the same as movement through a corridor, but it's the only information we had. And we found that ours was very, very high. 90% explained the density distribution of elephant observations, where the expert corridors were not. So you can use this, but you have to have data to validate corridors. You have to have occurrence data, movement data, or genetic data. And And often we apply to things we don't have those, so we use these expert-based models. So if you want to validate it, you need data. And if you have data, often you use data to parameterize it. So it's often tricky.
¿Alguien más? ¿Preguntas externas tenemos? Vale. Agradecemos. We thank you very much for your presentation. Bueno, para finalizar con las actividades del primer día del coloquio, los invitamos al centro de recepción del instituto, en donde podrán presenciar los carteles concursantes, así como participar en la sesión del café científico, cuyo objetivo es interactuar de manera más relajada con los investigadores invitados. Les recordamos también que hay todavía 2 lugares para 2 investigadores y 1 para un estudiante para la cena de la Salud 100, que será al finalizar el café científico para todos los que tienen cupo para ir. Nos iremos después del café. Las actividades de mañana iniciarán a las 9 para que lleguen puntuales y gracias por su participación. We are thankful Dr. Cushman for this really good talk. To finish our first day of activities, we invite you to join us at the new reception center, where we will discuss the poster session, and along with our scientific coffee break session activity, which is going to be more relaxed.
¿Está? ¿En el programa aquí? Sí.